I'd call the member for Hasluck.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak on the carbon tax bills. I found with interest the speech of the member for Adelaide, because it is our responsibility as members of this House to debate the issues when they impact significantly on all Australians and families and individuals, and that there must be always the opportunity to look at those elements that are constructive within legislation, but also those elements that have those flow-on consequential outcomes that we don't plan for. And what disturbs me is the number of bills that have been introduced into this House and rammed through this Parliament, because I don't think that there would be too many members of this House that have read each of those bills thoroughly. And to make reference to the fact that the Coalition has force-fed its members with a set of fact sheets in order to deliver speeches would not be dissimilar, if that was the case, to government members, because it would be an interesting test to see how many members have really read every one of the bills thoroughly and understood them. No, I think we're talking about the carbon tax, member, not work choices. Work choices is dead and buried. But prior to 2010 federal election, the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, stated the following as an election promise. This is a promise to Australians. She promised it clearly and concisely. There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead. And prior to the 2010 federal election, Treasurer Wayne Swan stated the following as an election promise, again clearly and concisely. No, it's not possible that we are bringing in the carbon tax. That is a hysterically inaccurate claim being made by the Coalition. Isn't it interesting to hear members of the government now saying and using that as the antithesis for our debating on the points of concern around this legislation? The Labor Party under Julia Gillard's leadership was elected in August 2010 on the basis of the promise not to introduce a carbon tax. But in February 2011, Prime Minister Gillard announced that a carbon tax would be introduced in Australia by June 2012, despite her very plain pre-election promise not to do so. In a speech at an AIG luncheon on the 6th of February 2008, former Climate Change Minister Penny Wong stated, "The introduction of a carbon price ahead of effective international action can lead to perverse incentives for such industries to relocate or source production offshore. There is no point in imposing a carbon price domestically which results in emissions and production transferring internationally for no environmental gain." And we have heard time and time again references to the government's own documents that showed that we will not get the emission reductions that they purport to achieve. Senator Wong admitted that imposing a carbon tax would encourage or force industries to go offshore, losing Australia's valuable resources and creating unemployment. She went on to state that a carbon tax is a recipe for abrupt and unpredictable change, as the government would need to adjust the tax frequently to try and meet the emissions reduction target, each time subjecting these adjustments to the inherent uncertainties embedded in the political process. The government's former Climate Change Minister also admitted to the Australian newspaper on the 23rd of February in 2009 that a carbon tax does not guarantee emission reductions. Her admissions prove that the government has known for some time that a carbon tax is not really the way to guarantee the reduction of emissions. Therefore, in my mind, it has only one other purpose, and that is to raise revenue for government. It is more than obvious that the carbon tax is really a scam to fleece the Australian public of billions of dollars with no guarantee that the emissions will be reduced because of it. Let me say, in the Clean Energy Bill, when I read through the bill, and I read it from cover to cover, and I found it fascinating, and I found there are some areas that I would like to certainly, if I had time, debate in the future. But the objects of the Act is to give effect to Australia's obligations under the Climate Change Convention, a United Nations document which sets out the premise for carbon emission reductions in UN nation members. And when you read through it, it's a very interesting document because having it enshrined in domestic legislation means it now applies within Australia. The Kyoto Protocol, and that was to put price on greenhouse gas emissions in a way that encourages investment in clean energy and supports jobs and competitiveness in the economy and supports Australia's economic growth while reducing pollution. The United Nations framework, when you read it, is very fascinating because it talks about the parties to this convention, but it says, noting that there are many uncertainties in the predictions of the climate change, particularly with regard to the timing, magnitude and regional patterns thereof. The parties should take precautionary measures to anticipate, prevent or minimise the causes of climate change and to mitigate its adverse effects. Now, that mitigation would also apply equally to a number of other factors. Instead of ramming through legislation without proper debate that would allow its examination to occur, it doesn't matter whether it's 20 years ago or not, member, you have an obligation to the constituents within your electorate to be open and honest with them. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty, and this is interesting, the lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing such measures. It's fascinating that you have a scientific argument, but you say in the times of uncertainty that you're prepared to still proceed and not hear the opposing views, because in the science field there are many on both sides who have the logic of argument for the basis of why there should or shouldn't be a carbon tax. But I hear that anybody who challenges the views of those who are proponents either call them flat earthers like Al Gore did in his lead up to his election, and then certainly in his current role of creating a fear campaign around the globe, but certainly by members of government who, when people raised issues, would say they are climate deniers. It is scary within a democracy that we try and shut down debate because a philosophical position of a government prevails over the top of further debate within our society. Look, I don't have to read any more, members. It's important that you also do some reading. Where there are, such measures, taking into account that policies and measures to deal with climate change should be cost-effective so as to ensure global benefits at the lowest possible cost. And it also says to take climate change considerations into account to the extent feasible in their relevant social, economic and environmental policies and actions, and employ appropriate methods, for example, impact assessments, formulated and determined nationally with a view to minimising adverse effects on the economy, on public health and on the quality of the environment of projects or measures undertaken by them to mitigate or to adapt to climate change. Our solution: the Labor Greens government has no mandate to introduce the carbon tax legislation, and the coalition will oppose carbon tax legislation at every step of the way. Our position is clear. We will vote against the carbon tax legislation to ensure that the measured debate that needs to occur happens. I want to reflect on my father's comments. He always said to me, the Labor Party looks after the working man and the working family. He was right. And he was right in that era and in that period. And what I see now are members on the other side who are not prepared to stand up for the families within their electorates and defend them against a tax that has a cascading flow-on effect. Maybe in the past they did, but the Gillard government doesn't, and it has demonstrated that in this debate. The carbon tax will mean $9 billion in a new tax year, a 10% hike in electricity bills in the first year alone, and I have people in my electorate who will feel the impact of that measure, whereby they will not use and access that electricity. A 9% hike in gas bills in the first year alone, higher marginal tax rates for low and middle income earners, and a $4.3 billion hit on the budget bottom line. Who pays for this? Not members of the government, but individuals and families of Australia. I also want to express my concern that the tax cuts and cash grants are inevitably subject to the vagaries of annual budgets and therefore are always at risk. Additionally, I am more a supporter of direct action to improve engineering and procedure practices of pollution sources as more reliable and permanent methods of reducing pollution. And some of my constituents, and I've had a lot, stop me in the street, and I've never had this experience, of people walking up in droves saying, get rid of this tax. And I want to cite 4 of my constituents. I would love to know how I can help stop this carbon tax. Another, I wish to register my disagreement with the carbon tax, which I do not believe our current government has a mandate to introduce. I have emailed the Prime Minister my concerns along the same lines. Please voice my concern against this tax. Another, I will be ineligible for any type of compensation under the proposed new carbon tax scheme. I am already struggling to pay ever-increasing electricity bills. I cannot afford solar panels or other expensive green gadgets to cut energy consumption. I have a heart condition that requires me to use air conditioning in summer, but I will no longer be able to afford it thanks to this government. The worst thing about it is, and this is business voices now, and I've been talking to small businesses, the worst thing about it is that there are no proven facts that this is going to change anything. I am keen to help the environment, but not to be the only country in the world that is taking these steps. Costs are high enough for running a business. We have a lot of staff here, and we want to move on past the GFC and not go backwards. And that's from Michael Roberts, the Centre Manager of Pertic Fluid Transfer Solutions in Midland. Another group, we are a group of hard-working people who believe the carbon tax is a tax on both businesses and the people in them. We do not want bigger government to redistribute wealth in the name of the environment. We feel this tax is a front to fund an ideology with no material benefit to the environment. We run a flourishing recycling business which we formed and funded to assist the environment, and we do not ask others to pay for it based on our ideologies. Care of the environment is a science, not a religion, and that's from Damien Cole of the Damien Cole Group in South Guildford. Another, I do not like to be negative, and I've always believed in attacking the job and not the person. I travel overseas several times a year, mostly to China and India. I tell myself these places are humanity out of control and the planet cannot sustain this growth. More and more people relying on less and less people to grow their food. I believe all of us need to be accountable for the life we live. This applies to carbon emissions, and the Gillard government proposal is fundamentally flawed by penalising a few big companies and cooking the books to show how it will be financially viable for everybody. I believe we should all be accountable for the carbon emissions, not just a few big companies. If everyone is accountable for reducing carbon emissions, and it is logical that one simple law affecting everyone will change everyone's outlook, which will automatically control the big polluters. If we are not all held accountable, there will always be an excuse why it's someone else's problem. If Australia sets a simple, effective template on carbon control for everyone to embrace, then the world's big countries and polluters will follow. And that was John Power, the Managing Director of Equipment Search Proprietary Limited at Maddington. Another, the carbon tax would be just used by the Prime Minister to redistribute money to the people 3 months before an election to buy votes. It will have no positive impact on the environment, but the companies affected will just pass on their costs, and many smaller businesses will take advantage of this and increase their prices. All this for no real impact on the environment, and that's Ian Lavington, Managing Director at Hydraulic Resource Bellevue. Jared Hewitt at Still Shop Midland also registered his opposition to the carbon tax this morning. When I visit shopping centres, people in the streets, they all say there is a need for debate. They cannot comprehend how this government is so keen to ram this legislation through the House. What I see fundamentally is the cascading taxes in the way in which we pour champagne into a stack of glasses and watch the flow-on effect of the champagne from that top glass down to the others. I have within my electorate families who will suffer under this taxing regime. They already struggle now. Let me say, I don't think there is any member in government who would go without food at any time on any day, nor have to relinquish the opportunity of buying medications and the necessities of life like I see families in my electorate. And I will continue to champion and advocate for families who will be affected by this tax and I will continue the debate as long as I need to in order to protect their interests and give them a quality of life that they richly deserve.
Order.
Thank
The
you,
member's
Deputy Speaker.
time has expired.